it is time to begin. I'm hoping that my support team here will let me know if I'm talking over somebody. I certainly hope I'm not doing that. I'm really happy to be joining you all today. This has been not what I expected. I was hoping I was going to be in San Diego with you today, but a hip injury has me here in my living room in Flagstaff. So thankfully, hip injuries don't impact one's thinking. And thankfully, we have Zoom that we can do this together. So thank you. My gosh, when I looked at the symposium lineup of different discussions, I thought this is not going to be easy. This is going to be definitely one of those things where, gosh, there are a lot of things to choose from that are really good. So thank you for being in this presentation with me here today. We're going to be talking about traditional food preparation techniques and of course, how that relates to one's vitality. And, I want to give you a little bit of background as to, here it is, I'm a doctor of acupuncture and Chinese medicine. And, why did I, really get going in this direction? I think all of us as acupuncturists, I feel like we've been so fortunate to have a great, well-rounded education. And it is something that, of course, incorporates the energetics of food and looking at food beyond just that biomedical, macronutrient perspective, but really getting into the energetics of it. And so I was into nutrition before I went to PCOM and got my master's degree, but it was after PCOM when I really started delving more into not just organic food, but, whole foods in their best format, their original format. And it's something that I think takes on special significance when someone maybe isn't feeling well. It could be yourself, it could be someone in the family. And I definitely had my own digestive issues. That's what brought me to acupuncture in the first place as a patient, and then, of course, to go on and study. But it was issues that we were having with my son's health. He always seemed to kind of have a cold, and I actually took him to a dental appointment. And I just want to give you this quick segue so that you understand how much of an impact I think that nutrition can have on one's health. And so we took Grant to a dental appointment. He had never had one before. I think he was probably 4 years old. And at the time, we're an organic family. I'm a natural health care practitioner, we're eating grass-fed. And even doing gluten-free, this sort of thing. And the interesting thing is this practitioner comes out to the waiting room to meet me, and she says, we're going to have to extract a couple of your son's primary teeth. They're just so riddled with cavities. And I was so shocked because here it is, as a family, we were doing all the right things in my mind. We were eating well, the kids didn't eat a lot of candy. Everything, again, was organic, not treating them with standard medication unless absolutely necessary. And so to find that my son's dental health was in such poor condition really was shocking to me. And again, especially because of what we were doing around our nutrition. And so I know a lot of parents would back that up and say, well, we just need to get this child, brushing teeth better. And we certainly said that too, but I just knew that there was something going on internally with Grant. And I really looked at why was it that we were doing something in how we were feeding him that was actually making his body allocate resources, his little growing body. Why is it that his body didn't have the mineral content, the protein content that was needed to maintain these primary teeth? And so that's when I said, wow, it's not enough to just go organic. It's not enough to just do grass-fed. I need to look at this at a deeper level. And that's really when I started looking at not just the quality of food, but how the food is prepared. And that's when we really get into looking at traditional food preparation methods. And so what we did in our family is I took all of us off of grains for over a year. We ate no grains. What we did for carbohydrates instead was we did sweet potatoes and rice and things like that. And I noticed I was just kind of hungry all the time. There wasn't a feeling of satiety that you get when you have some grains in your diet. And in that year, I really studied food preparation methods, using techniques that actually pre-digest the food so that it's easier for us to put to use in our body and actually helps to extract greater nutrition from many of the foods that go through these processes. And so in doing so, that is when I decided, well, I'm understanding what some of the science is that's happening with these traditional techniques, things like fermenting and soaking grains and beans. And so I began really studying that, and we incorporated grains back into our diet about a year later, but I began working with them in a fermented soaked state, very different than what we'd been eating before. And we all did really well with it. And I thought, well, I understand what's happening here from a scientific perspective of, cleaving out things that we don't want. And so why couldn't this happen even with working with gluten? And so I decided to do that. And we started making sourdough bread at home. And where gluten really appeared to have been a major issue contributing to what was going on with Grant, it no longer was an issue once we began to handle things this way. And so fast forward now, Grant is 13 and a half years old, and he's never had another cavity. And it's not because he's really awesome with brushing his teeth. And so just from a personal experience, that's how I got going with all of this. And I have just been so amazed at how impactful it is. And so today is just really what I'm hoping it's going to be is an inspiration to you, to help you to decide if this is something you want to bring into your own health practice, and of course, something that you want to share with your clients as well. Because nutrition is a place where everybody has to do something on their own. It's different than coming for an acupuncture treatment. So let's go ahead and we'll just hop right in here. And so, we're talking about this here. What do you consider, to be traditional food preparation techniques? That's something that, is open to a little bit of interpretation, but kind of in a nutshell, what I would say is, it's ancestral practices. It's doing things, differently than we did them before the advent of refrigeration and chemical preservatives. Also, even canning. Canning is kind of new on the scene in terms of its ability to be used to, hold on to food for a long time. So even canning is kind of a new technological invention, which is a funny thing, I think. And then, of course, lack of reliance on modern tools and technology. And I say that, and of course, we'd be using knives, whether we're in a modern kitchen or an old-timey kitchen. But in any instance, we're not working with things like microwaves and convection ovens, that sort of thing. And, these are also methods that they foster ease. They foster ease in the digestion. Oftentimes, they actually foster ease in terms of the amount of time that it takes to prepare a given food. So it's that sort of thing. And we have to remember that these types of techniques, they came about oftentimes as a means to make the most of whatever food was available, so that nothing went to waste. And these are also techniques that have been used for food preservation methods. And so it was helping people to get through winters, without fresh food, that sort of thing. And then finally, traditional food, if we're looking at it from the perspective of what that looked like at one time, and even still in different areas today, we're talking about a certain degree of nutrient density that is going to be inherent in that food. Before we got into modern agricultural practices, soil was something that was much more replete. The plants and the animals themselves were so much more robust because they were not being catered to as they are in the industrial food production that we have now. And also weakened because of us trying to extract as much as we can out of a given entity, whether that's, a stalk of celery and a field of celery, or a feedlot situation for cows. So we've really switched the dynamic in terms of the quality of the very base ingredients that our bodies have become accustomed to. And by that, I mean from a historical perspective. It hasn't been until about the last 100, 150 years or so that we're talking about some of these concerns. And so from the biological perspective, the genetic perspective, our body is expecting something much more robust than what we're giving it in terms of modern nutrition. And so, how does this show up? There are a lot of ways that this shows up in our practices. And one really big one, I think, is diabetes, type 2 diabetes. It's, 2015, 30 million Americans afflicted with type 2 diabetes, 84 million pre-diabetic. And so we're talking huge, huge numbers here of people who are dealing with, at the base of it all, cellular inflammation. And in turn, it's the 7th leading cause of death in the United States. And of course, it is often concurrent with so many other issues related to one's health. Cardiovascular disease, Alzheimer's disease. And so as a result of, I believe, so many lifestyle choices that we make today. And again, the food to me is cornerstone to that. And so, type 2 diabetes, it lends itself toward greater risk of these secondary complications, and much more so than even type 1 diabetes, which, we consider gestational diabetes. Many people consider type 1 diabetes to be an autoimmune presentation. And in this instance, that's another consideration that we have to look at in terms of the number of people who are afflicted with type 1 diabetes. I mean, I know here in our small town in Flagstaff, a number of people who have type 1 diabetes who were not born with the disease, but who developed it over time. And when we consider this possibly from an autoimmune perspective, this even has its roots in epigenetic expression and concurrent with, many believe, a leaky gut pattern. And we'll be talking about that a little bit here today. But when we look at type 1 diabetes, these secondary complications are not nearly as high as they are with type 2 diabetes. And that's because type 2 diabetes is really a lifestyle-driven disease for most people. And so because of that, we are oftentimes looking at, so many other secondary issues, again, kidney disease, nerve disease, eye disease. And, beyond diabetes, these are modern issues. Here are the top 10 leading causes of death, basically over the last 65 years. And the age-adjusted death rate increased for the first time since 2005. There are, of course, going to be many factors for that. But again, I believe that the lifestyle many people are leading today is a big player. The research supports that opinion. And so the life expectancy for the total population has decreased for the first time since 1983. So something is amiss here. So, when we look at some of these lifestyle diseases, we're talking about things like Alzheimer's, cardiovascular diseases, hypertension, heart disease. And all of this is, again, so deeply related to how and what we are doing, the things we're exposed to in our lives, whether we choose to be exposed to them or not. The diet or lifestyle of different populations might partly determine their rates of cancer, and the basis for the hypothesis was strengthened by results of studies showing that people who migrate from one country to another generally acquire the cancer rates of the new host country, suggesting that environmental, lifestyle, and I would say epigenetic factors rather than genetic factors are the key determinants of the international variation in cancer rates. Now, I'm going to be talking today about some aspects of epigenetics, but I'm going to actually begin very shortly here. I'm going to show you how this discussion began much earlier than what many of us, I think it's a buzzword now in medicine, but this is a practice, the pursuit of this is something that actually was undertaken oh gosh, 100 years ago, nearly that. So, all right. So this is showing up. One of the ways that this shows up is, of course, is obesity. And here are, here's just a quick schematic to show you that, over a 20-year period, the rate of obesity in the United States, look at how that increased. And, if we were to have one for, 2020, I'm sure we'd be seeing a lot more deep red. Of course, obesity is often hand in hand with many of these other lifestyle diseases that we see. Now, I posit that as we look at those graphs, that information, and the period of time over which it happened, I think we have to dial it back and say, okay, what the heck is going on? Yes, I mean, I think all of us recognize that, we're not nearly the busy, physically active, people that we once were even 50 years ago. However, the diet is a big part of it. And when we look here at this chart, we see in the mid-1970s, that's when a lot of newly introduced foods that were very high in carbohydrates were being introduced to market. And if we were to dial this back to looking at the last graph where we were considering, these increases in obesity, we see that it's kind of concurrent that as we had more of these snack foods introduced that were of a high caloric and low nutritional quality, we also saw this increase in weight gain. All right. And so again, I think one of the things that has happened is that we have been told, in modern times that we need to really cut back on the carbohydrates. And when I say modern times, I'm talking like the last, 5-6 years or so, where people are really looking at the impact of eating carbohydrates. And the difficult part of that is that we've got people lobbing good carbohydrates in with bad carbohydrates. And so when we look at the effect of different carbohydrates, and I know we all understand this, but I do want to point it out very quickly, we have blood sugar concentrations that get very spiked when we eat simple carbohydrate foods, treats. Whereas when we have more complex carbohydrates, what ends up happening is we see here this nice increase in our blood sugar and then a slow release of that. And that does not spike our insulin. This is a way to get this important macronutrient into our diet without it harming us. And so when I see these dietary recommendations of things, long-term ketogenic diets and long-term Atkins diets, I mean, I think as acupuncturists, we recognize that there is a balance that needs to be struck. And so because of that, that's what I'm looking to help incorporate with this concept of traditional food preparation techniques. And I think it's an important thing beyond just looking at the physical, but also getting into the mental impact, the emotional impact that we begin to see when we have a society that has not been doing well. And as we look here, we can see the suicide statistics that are happening in the United States. Unfortunately, it is something that is increasing. And I'm not saying that diet is the end-all answer to the issues that we see of the day. I hope it doesn't present that way. What I'm hoping that we'll see is that actually getting back to looking at diet more closely is something that can actually hopefully have impact. And I hope that with today's presentation, you'll see why I really believe that. So the history of modern food practices in the United States, this is just a super brief overview, but I wanted to share this. We have really come a long way in how we do things, what we do. And, in the late 1800s, it was figured that about 93% of food spending was for homemade food. And of course, that would be local, seasonal. It would be challenging to grow and to harvest and procure and prepare. Just that physical activity alone is something that we're so incredibly removed from. That alone would be keeping us engaged physically and mentally, just to be taking care of ourselves that way. In the 1920s, that's when we had an introduction of gas and electric ranges, refrigerators, and then a proliferation of grocery stores. And when we look at things like this, I mean, you can imagine how much easier life got as a result of this. Up until the advent of refrigerators and ice boxes, I mean, we were really dependent on fresh food and food that could be safely stored. And that's where using fermentation as a practice was actually one of the most important means of maintaining nutrition through the wintertime. Or, on long trips, where you just were away from fresh food, sea voyages, things like that. The proliferation of grocery stores. This is something that allowed people to be able to procure food that might have been much more processed so that it would become shelf stable. And of course, that also meant that people wouldn't need to be rearing as much of their own food and eating it fresh from the land. In around 1960, it's figured that about 18% of the income that people had was spent on food and about 5% was spent on healthcare. Switch forward to the 2000s, and that became about 9% going to food and about 17% to healthcare. So an incredibly huge shift. And, really, at the end of the day, I think this sums it up pretty well. Modern populations are increasingly overfed, malnourished, sedentary, sunlight deficient, sleep deprived, and socially isolated. These changes in lifestyle each contribute to poor physical health and affect the incidence and treatment of depression. So, this is something that food is such a communal experience. It's something that we share over and we live over. And it's something that has become very far removed from our experience with one another. And, when we consider the gut from the perspective of Chinese medicine, that's our earth, that's our grounding, that's our centeredness. And, Hippocrates hit it on the head, all disease begins in the gut. And if the gut is not happy, I mean, think about that from a Chinese medicine perspective. We think about the impact of that all the way across the board. It can be sadness. It can be a wishing for things. It can be apathy. That can show up emotionally that way. And this is where, speaking to your patients about their nutrition is so powerful in my mind, because you don't just get to speak to it from the perspective of biomedicine, but you can also bring into it the qualities of energetics that you learn through your Chinese medicine training. So to me, it's such a powerful way to speak to people, and they just really seem to appreciate seeing the world in a different light. And so this relates back to a concept called the Cycle Biome. And here we argue that the consumption of fermented foods, which is something I'm going to be talking about today, may be particularly relevant to the emerging research linking traditional dietary practices and positive mental health. The extent to which traditional dietary items may mitigate inflammation and oxidative stress may be controlled, at least to some degree, by the microbiota. Now, the microbiota is the microbiome, and I'm sure all of us have heard about the microbiome. And, I think most of us would consider that's in our gut, but the microbiome is all over us. It's in our nose, it's all our orifices, it's on our skin. And so this is all components of the psychobiome. And it's true. The research is panning out that fermented foods, which are part of the traditional food compendium, really seem to have quite a positive impact on the brain and the mood. So powerful stuff for our patients, powerful stuff for society at large. And so here's an up close and personal showing the layers of the wall enteric nervous system. And we can see here what this shows us is this incredible motor and sensory connection between what's going on at the gut and at the level of the brain, and how these two systems communicate back and forth with one another. You know, there is a reason that they call it the second brain. This is where a lot of stuff happens, is in the gut related to neurotransmitter production. So when we look at this schematic right here, we can see by way of the sympathetic ganglia, the spinal cord, and the vagus nerve that there's a direct correlation between the mind and the gut, and as well the gut microbiota influencing production of things like cytokines, precursors to 5-HTP, GABA, and of course this is going to be influencing mood and inflammatory processes. So I love this schematic. You know, it just really kind of breaks it down to show you, you know, what's going on where and how these things really do have an incredible impact on one another. And so this is, you know, I just wanted to include this in here, just some various research supporting how important it is to look after the microbiome in so many aspects of wellness. You know, here it is. It's central nervous system, immune system, you know, situations relating to how we synthesize vitamins. You know, we really need to keep our microbiome happy, cruising along, giving it the nutrition it needs, and keeping it in balance. Because there are a number of associated conditions, you know, these resultant concerns related to this. And, you know, I've mentioned already leaky gut. And, you know, I just want to clarify, leaky gut is something that is not considered a alternative concept. Maybe at one time it was, but now medicine is, you know, Western medicine is definitely recognizing that this is a very real condition. Inflammatory diseases, toxin assaults, cancer, dysbiosis of the gut, falling victim to pathogens, failing immune system, of course, having issues with antibiotics, keeping them, you know, functioning for your body if you need them. And then all these things also just add up to the aging process. You know, that is all impacted by how happy our belly is and how we are putting to use the nutrition that we bring in to our mouths and put it to use in our body. And, you know, we've got this nervous connection to and from the brain with the gut, afferent and efferent microbiome gut-brain axis. And one of the things that I want to talk about here, when you see this little pink bar here in the middle that says LPS, that is lipopolysaccharides. And those are found in the outer portion of gram-negative bacteria, things like Salmonella and E. coli. And what this graphic shows is the, sorry about that, bump back there. This shows the impact on immunity, inflammatory response, as well as, of course, how that correlates to the nervous system function. Once any amount of these lipopolysaccharides get, you know, great amount gets into the bloodstream. Now, this happens more frequently when we're eating the modern diet of processed foods, and it lends itself toward being even more of an issue when we have stress concerns, PTSD, things like that. These types of emotional impacts actually lend themselves back toward leaky gut. And the leaky gut allows the lipopolysaccharides, the LPS, to get into the system, and it creates this chicken or egg kind of presentation of increased sensitivity at the level of the nervous system, the immune system, and it impacts the brain. And so when we're looking at GI health and psychiatric health, I mean, these seemingly disparate conditions and concerns, again, can have an incredible correlation between the gut and the brain. And again, epigenetics, the lifestyle choices we make, the things we're exposed to, the foods we're eating, the way that we exercise or don't exercise, the way that we socialize or don't socialize, all of that has an epigenetic impact on how it is that we might express something that we maybe would have a genetic predisposition to, but under right circumstances wouldn't necessarily express that. And so this is where we begin getting into talking a little bit more deeply about epigenetics. And if I were there, I'd ask for a raise of hands to see if anyone is familiar with the work of a dentist from the United States.